My name's Doug Ogden. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight to hear a great lecture by the good Dr. Keith Evans. We're honored to have him talk about the history of healthcare in the basin, here in Roosevelt particularly. So we're honored to have him. I'd also like to point out that we have a spring poster, part of the series that has been produced by Luke Stradinger, and those are for sale, as well as a copy of Family Courageous, written by the cousin of Dale Larson, which describes the history of Roosevelt, at least some stories that are very entertaining and interesting. So without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Dr.
Hi, everyone. Thankful for the opportunity today to share a little bit. Turns out that all of my great-grandparents were original homesteaders in the basin. So my family goes way back as utilizers of the healthcare system from the beginning. The only thing more original than our family are the Ute Indians. So, and they had their own medicine, so we'll go from there. In 1900, Salt Lake had made the transition from a pioneer town to a thriving metropolis. They'd pretty well caught up with the rest of the United States. Let me just read to you a second. It says, life in Salt Lake at the turn of the century, this would be 1900, was no longer one of hardship and privation. The pioneer days were gone. Mansions lined South Temple. The McCune Mansion, built higher in the avenues. Saldair boasted the largest ballroom in the United States. Drama had been established in the valley with playhouses, elegant structures patterned after the English Theater on Drury Lane. The arts flourished as local artists went to Europe to study. Classes were taught and prizes were given for outstanding work. The tabernacle choir and the pipe organ sounded as part of the outstanding musical commitment of the people. Telephones had been ringing since 1880. Municipal waterworks, the electric company, the streetcar railway for city transportation all operated before the turn of the century. The city boasted 5 newspapers, a library, 12 banks, hot springs, mineral baths, and a bicycle racing track. While life in Salt Lake sparkled with new inventions and prosperity, another part of Utah, the Uinta Basin, was thrown open to settlers in 1905. The back-breaking harshness of pioneer life, similar to that in the Salt Lake Valley in the 1850s, was reenacted only 150 miles away. So, Salt Lake was a thriving metropolis. Things were going great. They had electricity and railroads, and people, the schools were doing great. People had great educations and had every advantage that they had back east. And 150 miles away, pioneer life was just starting again. My great-grandmother decided to come out here and be her name was Nancy Jane Nielsen. She lived in Midway and wanted to come out and be a homesteader, and before the basin was opened up, she moved to Vernal. They came out in a covered wagon. They camped at Red Creek. You know where Red Creek is? That's how far they made it the first day. And there were some Indians camped across the creek. And in the night, there was some thunder and lightning up across the Uintas, and the Indians got up and moved their camp. And about an hour later, here come a flash flood, almost washed them away. The Indians knew that when there was thunder and lightning in the mountains, there'd be a flash flood down that creek, and they moved away from it, but Grandma didn't know. So her mother, when she moved to Vernal, was a nurse and a midwife. She was a lay midwife. And she had one room in her home that she kind of used as a hospital room, and she would bring patients in and nurse them. and help them when they were ill. One day Butch Cassidy and his gang showed up at her house, and they said that one of their gang had been shot, and asked if she would come and help nurse him back to health. She agreed to go with them. They blindfolded her and led her up through Jones Hole or wherever they were going to their hideout, and she stayed for 2 weeks, nursed the guy back to health. They took her back home, again blindfolded, and gave her a $50 gold piece for her work. So after that, she moved to homesteaded in Arcadia, and she would go around and help deliver babies. My grandmother was a young girl at the time, and she would go and help her. And I remember grandmother telling me that her job was, after the baby was born, she would massage the woman's uterus on the abdomen, and that helped it contract down and stop the bleeding. And it's a procedure they still use today, massage the uterus to stop the bleeding. And grandma, as a teenager, would provide that service, and so that's kind of the way things went. There were doctors in Vernal clear back in the 1880s. Vernal was kind of a clash of cultures. Before the basin was opened up for settlement, there was a lot of Colorado people that came into Vernal, and so you had the LDS versus the non-LDS culture there, and that culture kind of spread over to Mighton when the basin was opened up for settlement. Mighton became the first booming metropolis, larger than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was just a spot in the road. Mighton had banks and saloons and dance halls. It was quite a place. When the church came to Mighton to build a chapel, the people got together and said, we don't want a chapel in Mighton. And so after some difficulty, the church leader said, okay, we'll build it in Roosevelt, and Mighton, you will never be anything. And it's pretty much what it is. There is a chapel in Mighton now, by the way. But I remember when I went to elementary school in Mighton as a young, in first and second and third grade, there were lots of old buildings that had then been abandoned. That was from the glory days in Mighton. Anyway, there was a doctor, the original doctor in the Uinta Basin was Dr. Miles, Lorraine Miles. She was born in Payson. She was one of 7 daughters. Her father wanted her to have a good education, so he took her to Salt Lake. And Salt Lake schools at that time were very excellent. They gave a good education. She got good grades. She went to the University of Utah and got good grades. And by the time she graduated from the University of Utah, she knew that she would be able to go to medical school. She decided that she was not as good looking as her sisters, although her picture shows that she's quite a good looking lady. But she didn't think she was as good looking as her sisters, didn't think she'd ever get married. And so she decided to devote her life to, originally she wanted to be a nurse, but somebody said she was better at giving orders than taking orders, and so she ought to be a doctor. And so she went to medical school. She apparently had a photographic memory. She just whizzed through medical school. She seemed to, when she read the medical books, she could just almost quote them verbatim. And when she got through, she graduated with honors. She had opportunities to go all over the East to practice medicine, but she chose to come back to Utah. Her father, even though he is quite prosperous in Salt Lake, couldn't pass up the idea of being a rancher. And with the land in the Uinta Basin, he decided to come out here and be a rancher. And he actually bought a ranch in 9 Mile, of all places. And so she thought she would like to be near her family. She talked to church leaders. They gave her a blessing that if she came out here and practiced medicine, that she'd always have good health. and that she'd be blessed and be able to provide medical care out here. So she came out as a single young lady, fresh out of medical school, and began practicing. She bought a little house in Roosevelt, and one room of the house was where she would do her surgery. And the rest of the time she started out with a horse and buggy, and she would travel around and deliver her medical care, oftentimes through mud, rain, snow. Oftentimes people would go and take a team and help pull her wagon or her car out of the mud as she would travel from Duchesne, Altamont, Neola, all over the basin. She would travel to give medical care. It says that one day she traveled 150 miles and delivered 4 babies. Another day, she did 13 appendectomies in one day. I don't know, Dr. Buxton, did you ever do 13 in a day? That's a lot of appendectomies, isn't it? She was willing to go anywhere, do anything. A young boy up in the Hyuenas, he was at Chain Lakes, got bucked off a horse, and the horse had drug him. She rode a horse clear to Chain Lakes, it's 20 miles, went up, took care of the kid, patched him up, got him back, and put him on a stretcher, and they hand carried him out of the Hyuenas on a stretcher and brought him back, and he survived. But she was willing to go anywhere and do anything. Another story, one of the Wilkersons, he was an older guy. He was hunting, and he saw what he thought was it was a sick rabbit. Anyway, and then after that, he got really sick. He went out to doctors in Salt Lake. They couldn't figure out what was going on. He came back, and from her memory of reading her medical books, she was able to diagnose that he had tularemia, which was a disease spread by sick rabbits. And he remembered being bit by a mosquito about the time he saw that sick rabbit, and that's how it's transferred from animals to humans. And she made the first diagnosis of tularemia that was ever diagnosed in the state of Utah. And she did that just from the memory of her medical books. So, outstanding lady. Lynette was telling me that she remembered the story of Dr. Miles going up to the Neola Elementary School and lining the kids up and taking out their tonsils one at a time. Did the whole school in one day. So she was quite a lady. So she provided medical care for about 20 to 30 years, and then Dr. Larson came along. And as Dr. Miles was winding down, Dr. Larson seemed to take her place. And I think Dr. Larson was the doctor that delivered me, actually. And he provided medical care here in Roosevelt for many years. Dr. Buxton, can you tell me about Dr. Larson a little bit?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about it. Before Dr. Larson was Dr. Dunsmore.
Okay.
Was here. I don't know much about him, but Dr. Larson came out of World War II, just finished his practice, his training not long after World War II, and came to Roosevelt. He was 57 when I came to town, which was in '63. And he'd been in Roosevelt for 17 years. And Dr. Larson was a journalist, and he was also a bishop, and I think he was in the state presidency before I came. And he was a dedicated man. He worked hard. He'd been here a year and a half alone before I came out. Dr. Stringham had moved from Roosevelt to Vernon to be and where his family was from. And Dr. Larson had been here a year and a half after I came. And 2 years after I came, he developed cancer of the stomach and had to leave practice. And I was left with his practice for 9 months, and I about died. I wondered how he kept going along with for a year and a half without anything, but a lot of his patients followed Dr. Stringer. Dr. Larson died in the fall of, 1966.
So Dr. Miles had carried things up through World War II then. A couple of stories I forgot about Dr. Miles that related to my family. My grandmother Holgate, with her first pregnancy, had a very difficult delivery. And so Dr. Miles and her talked it over and said, you know, if you do this again, you'll probably die. So she decided to tie her tubes. And then 10 years later, my grandmother Holgate had a swelling in her abdomen, and she went to Dr. Miles and said, Dr. Miles, something's wrong. Dr. Miles checked her and said, oh my gosh, you are pregnant. And she had tied her tubes, and I know what that feels like. But, but anyway, so if that tubal ligation had not failed, I guess Gloria and I wouldn't be here, or at least I wouldn't be here. Gloria would be here because she was the daughter of the son. Anyway, the other story I have of Dr. Miles is that my grandmother Evans had a baby that was premature. It was about the size of your hand. He could fit right in your hand. He weighed about 2 pounds, and Dr. Miles told my grandma to take him home, that he probably wouldn't live through the night. And he has 11 children of his own. But my grandmother kept him in a shoebox on the lid of the stove, on the stove, on the door of the oven, and that's how she kept him warm. And he made it. She could take her wedding ring and pass it clear up to his shoulder on his arm. That's how tiny his arms were. But yes.
I've always been told that there's a hospital in Roosevelt. Is that little house next to the Mason Standard on New York? Is that, you know, if that's so?
Where Dr. Miles practiced, do you think?
Well, I was told it was the first hospital, so I don't know
Okay.
where she practiced.
I know it was it.
You know which one I mean?
Yeah, and I'm not sure where she lived, but I knew it was Dr. Larson. Yeah.
You left out Dr. Whitmore.
Okay, tell me about Dr. Whitmore.
Well, he was here about the same time that Dr. Miles was.
Okay.
I remember him when I was a kid, and his office was in his house, and it was just up the street west from where you're talking about, where you heard the hospital. There was right where, well, you know where Con and Paula Bell's house is on the corner?
Yep.
You come east, there's an alley. The first alley you come to, that house right there, and you used to go in the alley and you could go in the door there on the side of that house into Dr. Whitmore's office.
Cool. Okay. How long was he here, do you know?
I know it wasn't just a few months, it had to have been several years.
Several years. Okay.
How many years did Dr. Miles practice?
How long? Over 30 years, yeah. 5,000 babies, yeah. Besides all the other stuff that she did. Yes.
What was her maiden name?
Miles.
Well, then who was it? What was her married name?
And then she did marry, I think was it Alan? Yeah.
Alan, yeah.
And then she did get pregnant, but she had a miscarriage. That was the only pregnancy she had. She never had children of her own, but the man she married had a son, and she raised him. After she married, then he would drive her around to all of her appointments. Yeah. Okay. So,
Keith?
yes.
Dr. Miles died here in Roosevelt.
She did. I didn't realize that. In 1970.
Well, it was, the new hospital was built in 1969. We built the new hospital and the new clinic the same year. And it was a year or two after that that she came back here as an elderly lady. And I don't remember what her diagnosis was, but she died. And she died in our hospital.
Wow.
As an elderly lady.
Okay.
It was fun to kind of visit with her a little bit.
So,
She was pretty old.
so Dr. Miles would have taken the Uinta Basin from the opening of the reservation up through to World War II then, and then a few other doctors were here for a period of time, and then Dr. Larson came after World War II, kind of took us through the 50s, and then at the end of the 50s, the beginning of the 60s is when Dr. Buxton came, right?
Dr. Stringham had been here, had moved. He was in Roosevelt 11 years, and I came in 63, and so he had moved in 61, and so he had been here from 1950 to 1961, and moved back to Rome.
Right. So, when Dr. Buxton came, he was not only a gifted surgeon and doctor, but he was able to attract some help in the form of Dr. Frank Madsen and Dr. Gary White. And together, the three of them helped Roosevelt get through the 60s and into the 70s. And about 68, 69, when the oil boom came, things got really nuts around here. And those three doctors were working night and day and looking for all the help they could get to, but they kind of carried on the tradition that Dr. Miles and Dr. Larson had started, and it was a tradition of excellent medical care. And their care was so good that people would travel from Vernal to come over just to receive their medical care here in Roosevelt. And even though that required sitting in a waiting room and waiting for several hours to see a doctor, Dr. Buxton, Dr. Madsen, and Dr. White, together they kind of carried the load, and they had it set up so you saw whichever doctor could see you, and it was a matter of survival, of being able to survive and see as many patients. But they never turned away any patients, and they always worked until the work was done. It wasn't an 8-to-5 job by any means. Yes, Carol?
Maybe Terry can answer this, but I've always wondered, they were all trained at the same university, George Washington University. They had terrific practical experience at the D.C. General Hospital.
Absolutely.
Lots and lots of it.
They were prepared for rural practice.
They were internships. And so I've often wondered if that wasn't helpful in helping them to be able to practice together and helping them train somebody in the same way.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the three of you, Dr. Buxton? Tell me.
Pardon?
Why don't you tell us something about the three of you practicing together and some of the things you experienced?
Because it was, she said, because of George Washington University being trained in the same place, that maybe that was it.
Well, I came out here in 63, and Dr. Madsen was 2 years behind me in med school, and he was a classmate with Dr. White. Dr. Madsen also interned at the LDS hospital where I did. I took a general rotating internship, and I think he did too. That was where you went into each specialty and got as much experience as you could. And I think Dr. Madsen did, and also Dr. White. But
He did 6 months of internal medicine.
yeah, he did. Then he was drafted into
The
the
oldest
Army.
doctor in Utah.
And during that time, Dr. Madsen took up a surgical residency, and joined me after the surgical residency, and then we conned Dr. White into coming and joining the three of us, or the two of us, after he got out of the service. Another thing that was a real help to us was that for 3 years after I came, Dr. John Smith, a Salt Lake surgeon who had been a family practitioner in Duchesne, came out once a week. He was doing this with Dr. Larson when I came, and he'd come out once a week on Thursdays, his day off, and we would work up the cases that we needed to have him help us do that we weren't trained to do at that time. And after 3 years of working with him, I got so that I could pretty much do what he dared to do out here without the backup of anesthesia and the backup of a lot of internal medicine. And most people he did out there, or we sent out to other people. But that's what really helped us to get going with a lot of surgical procedures. Dr. White and Dr. Madsen had a year's surgery, and that helped. And when Dr. White got back, he was a little more experienced in internal medicine, and so that helped us. We set it up so that we would work one weekend out of 3, and we would be on second call the next weekend, and the next weekend we'd be off. And the same with our days in the clinic. We would rotate who was in our little office building one day, and who was taking care of the clinic and emergency room that day, and we rotated it so that we could have a little family time, a little time off, and so that's how it worked.
Vacation, it was pretty bad.
Yeah, we could take a little vacation again. But that's how it pretty much worked. We got up to, I think there were 6 of us that were in family practice that did that. And that was great when there were 6 of us doing it.
So that took us through the 60s and 70s, and I arrived in 1980. Originally, I came as a medical student. When I came to Salt Lake to interview for my residency, I came out here to visit some relatives. I ran into Dr. Buxton, and he learned that I was a medical student, that I was graduating from medical school 6 months early by not taking any vacation my last 2 years, and he made me an offer to come out and practice, and that he would pay me $1,000 a month and give me a place to live if I would come and work for 6 months. And just as I arrived here, Dr. Madsen had got colon cancer, and he was unable to continue to practice. And so as a 4th-year medical student just out of medical school, I took over Dr. Madsen's practice and worked for 6 months under Dr. Buxton and Dr. Condi and Dr. White's tutelage, and they helped me. Yeah, and they helped me. We delivered babies, we did C-sections, we did everything. I was kind of young looking back then. I didn't look 26, I don't think. And so when I would walk into the room, the patients would go, like, let this kid in here. But it was a great experience, and when I got into my internship, which was the same internship that Dr. Buxton spoke of at LDS Hospital, my experience here in Roosevelt had helped me get the experience so that I could do things that the other medical students had no idea, because I'd been out here doing it for 6 months. And while I was here, I recognized that there was a need for high-risk obstetrics, and with the experience that I had when I went back, they invited me to an OB residency, and so I stayed for another 4 years and completed that training before I returned to Roosevelt. But one of the most interesting transitions that I witnessed was when I first came here, was the tremendous nursing shortage. The only way we had nurses was if a young woman decided to go to nursing school and then happened to come back to the Uinta Basin or marry somebody from the Uinta Basin, or a family moved here where the wife was a nurse and the husband had a different job. But there was probably only 8 or 10 nurses in the whole Uinta Basin when I came here in 1980. And so in the hospital, you would have one nurse, RN, and she would be in charge of all the sick patients in the hospital, the ICU. She ran the emergency room, and she helped deliver the babies. And she literally ran from one spot to the other, to the other, to the other, taking care of patients, the whole shift. It was a tremendous responsibility, and there was just no nurses. While my dad was administrator at the hospital for a period of years, he even sent to the Philippines, and we recruited nurses from the Philippines, and one of them came and worked and stayed, and that's Chana Dart, who is, and that's how Chana came to the basin, and then she eventually married Bruce Dart. But the extreme nursing shortage was so bad that it was hard to, the doctor can work, but if he doesn't have a nurse to help him, and the nurse kind of keeps the hospital running. To show you the difference, there's probably at any given time 12 or 15 nurses on each shift at the hospital, working in the emergency room and the OB and the medical and the ICU and taking care of everything. So when we brought in the nursing school and we started training our own homegrown nurses, that made it possible for us to start recruiting more doctors. And so that's when we were able to start bringing in more and more specialists, and we have grown from the 6 doctors that Dr. Buxton spoke of 30 years ago, to where we have 60 doctors at the hospital right now. And so it was the nursing school that brought in that started training our own homegrown nurses that made all that happen, so that we could grow our medical community and grow into the medical community that we have now. I think that when people come to Roosevelt, they can say, Roosevelt people can say, we have a good medical community. We have something we can be proud of. And when people leave, I used to hear them say, I'm sorry we have to leave our doctors, because I feel like they felt like they got good care when they were here. And all that started clear back with Dr. Miles and the other doctors, Dr. Larson and then Dr. Buxton and Dr. White and Dr. Madsen, build upon that and build an excellent reputation that's still here today of the good medical care that we have in our community. And we have a good hospital and a medical staff that we can be proud of. It used to be that people weren't so excited to come out to a small town. And then the cities just kept getting bigger and bigger and more problems. And when I first came, everybody that I knew in the city said, why are you going to Roosevelt? Why would you do that? And 20 or 25 years later, they say, oh, well, we wish we were where you are. So our small communities have become more and more attractive as the cities become less and less attractive for a place to raise a family and raise children. And I watch our young people as they leave and go on missions, that they excel in the mission field, and they come home and do well because they, in a small town, it's a good place to learn to work, and it's a good place to grow up, and it's a good place to have good friends, and to have a village that everybody cares about each other, and you help raise your kids together. And I look out over the audience, and those of us who have raised our children together, it was a great experience to go through that together, and we're still good friends because of it. Yes, Carol.
The ambulance is a very interesting story too. When we first came out, it was Stewart who had the nursing home, had the ambulance service. It was a station wagon. And as I recall, and Terry would remember this, they hung the blood just out of the window because it wasn't enough height. And when they got to Strawberry, the blood would freeze and
oh my goodness.
I didn't get that.
The ambulance service, wasn't it just a station wagon and the Stewart's van? And they hung the blood out the window, if I recall.
That was another thing that developed, like the nursing, is our ambulance service really helped us. When I first came out here, all we had was the hearse.
Ted Altman with that.
Ted Altman took us out.
Yes.
Dr. Manson and I went out in the corn patch and got a guy that had been in the PTO and ruined his trachea, and we had to hold it open as soon as we got him back and put a tube in his throat and shipped him to Salt Lake. But it was Dwayne Richards, a highway patrolman, that saved the guy's life. He was there and he had training, and he actually saved the guy's life right out in the field by holding him open and keeping his airway open out there. And you know, the other thing was, we talk about us doctors doing things, but the community rose to the occasion and built the hospital. The people of this community have been wonderful that way.
Absolutely. David.
On the recruiting, I remember Dr. Buxton and coming when I was a younger man, that there were local citizens that got together to try to help recruit, and I know that Dad was involved with an automobile, you know, and trying to make it so they could afford and work those things. So the community was really trying to get that, just as it goes on today. But those were such critical times. I think when Dr. Stringham left, it was quite a blow to our city, and you know, Dad drove the ambulance or the hearse a lot to help Ted out, so he didn't have to leave. So it was interesting about these things.
Yeah, I think there's a story that several of the citizens of the community went with Dr. Buxton out to talk to Dr. Madsen to convince him to come and practice with him. And yeah, you're right, the community was definitely involved in helping that recruitment.
We were ready to leave until we got Dr. Madsen. We almost had our suitcases packed, and then the community rose to the occasion and helped us. He couldn't have lived through it, really, all alone.
You got that close, huh?
I hardly slept at night.
Yeah.
I heard from the nurses that they would call him at night and he'd go to sleep on the telephone and make loud noises on the phone to wake him back up while he was talking.
Then my wife's cold feet would come on my back and said, "You better get up."
Yes, Dave.
What's the history of the county? When did they become, when did things become county-owned facility? I imagine there was the church point in
Yeah.
there.
It was the first hospital was actually owned by the church. It was an LDS hospital, and when the church divested themselves of hospitals, they gave the hospital to the county, and the stake presidents in the county formed the hospital board. So.
What year would this have been around?
In the 60s, wasn't it?
In the 60s and 70s, yeah. So whenever
Snow was state president.
Yeah, it would have been in the 60s. Yeah, whenever the church divested themselves of their hospitals in Salt Lake and turned it over to Intermountain Healthcare, that's when they turned it over to the county here. And so originally, if you were a stake president, you were on the hospital board.
Like President Rivera now.
Yeah. Yeah, they've always had a hand in it, it seems like. So that's how it transitioned from the church to the county.
Keith?
Yes.
The hospital that we have now was built in 1969. It was about 1966 or 7. I think it was 1967, because when Dr. White joined us in 68, we were in that one little office that Dr. Stringham had, and we knew we had to build a new office. We didn't have room. And we built our office the same year that the hospital was built. But the church offered to give the county the hospital and the piece of land that the church is on now, or the new hospital's on now. And they had a meeting, and they said, we'll go for it. Because we'd known what it was like to try to gain funds from Salt Lake for this menial equipment in our hospital. And now what's happened? The hospital's grown, the money comes back and stays here. And I don't think there's a better 42 or 43 bed hospital in the nation than we got right here.
I think you're right. Yes, Lynette?
Two questions. How many doctors did you say are practicing now? And I'm sure that includes visiting ones. And then, aren't we one of the few county-run hospitals in the nation?
Yes. I think Moab is a county hospital, but I think that's the only one left in the state of Utah. And yeah, there's very few independent hospitals that are like ours.
Beaver's still an independent.
Is it? I think it's city-owned. I think it's city-owned, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it is city-owned.
Yeah. So.
How many doctors?
60.
60. I thought that's what you said.
Yeah.
It says there's 60 doctors, that includes visiting doctors.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So Phil Condi was here, what years?
It's from 68. I think Phil came in 68.
And it was about 80.
That's when we came, and I think he came a little bit after.
Oh, maybe. Okay. You came in 68, and so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Phil Condi.
Phil Condi came in 72.
72. Okay.
And when did he have his accident and have to?
79.
79.
Yeah. So. Oh, yeah. No, actually, it was after. So I'm sorry. About 81. About 81. Yeah. Last.
He went down to St. George and did a lot of good down there.
Yeah.
On the hospital board and helped head up the Congo's house down there and was very active in the community. I think it was college.
Okay.
When did the church build the old hospital, so they actually had a hospital? They were now operating at home.
I think it was 1947.
Was it right after World War II then? Right after the war?
It was, my sister Diana was one of the first born there.
And she was born in 47. Okay. And the church built it, but the community had to equip it, as I understand. And the community went together and bought and provided the money. And I remember on the old delivery table it said donated by the Relief Society or something. Yeah. So.
I can give a little idea about how we got the money.
Okay.
Right quick. Once they accepted the fact that they were going to become a county hospital, they passed a bond issue, which passed was 65% yes, which is a pretty good bond issue pass. And then the Hill-Burton funds, which is a fund set up by the government for rural hospitals, kicked in about 40% of the cost of the hospital. And the Ute tribe, since we had 40% of our occupancy was Ute Indians, the Bureau of Indian Affairs kicked in 40%, and built the wing on the Indian, those who remember the old Indian wing, they had their offices there for the Indian Health Service. And so, golly, we came out with lots of money left over for good equipment, and it just worked out really good for the citizens of the county to have that much help. And one word about the nurses. Keith well described the nursing shortage. But when we got our own nurses, and I'm sure he will remember, our nurses trained in our hospital, and they rotated around in every service. They were far better nurses than we could hire from somewhere else because they had far more experience than anywhere else.
So, in closing, I just got one story to tell you about the nurses and Dr. Buxton. When Dr. Buxton's boys were younger, one of them got a motorcycle. And so Dr. Buxton brought the motorcycle down to the hospital, And he was going to show the nurses that he could do a wheelie on this motorcycle. So he got them all out in front of the hospital. And he got on this motorcycle. And he did a wheelie right through the glass doors of the hospital. And all the nurses thought he was dead. It scared them all to death. But it was quite impressive. Something they'll never forget.
The nurses learned that I do some outdoor language.
He was just practicing for the horses.
That's right. Yeah, that was just the warm-up to the horse accident that that he had.
Keith was off. He had to come back and cover me.
Does anyone have any questions or any other comments? Yes.
From a professional standpoint, I'm kind of curious to know what dentistry was like here in Roosevelt prior to me coming.
Who was the dentist? Dr.
Mantilla.
Mantilla.
Here by himself.
By himself for years and years. When I was a kid, I can remember going to Dr. Mantilla.
I still see him at the Utah Dental Association meetings every year. He's an amazing man, still very active.
His wife just passed.
And when did you start, Dale? You were the only other one, right? For years?
No. There were two brothers that lived here that were dentists, and I'm trying to think of what their name was. And their office was there just a little bit east or west of the commercial club. And I can remember going in there one day to visit with one of them. It was when I was home from dental school. And Gordy Hartson was in there having his dental work done. He was just a little kid, and was he ever raising a roof? I kid him about that. I can't remember where those guys were from, but they were here for a few years. They were brothers. And then they both got called up to go to the Korean War or something.
Mm-hmm.
They got called up in the military, and they left, and that's when Don Mantilla came here, and he actually started out in Duchesne. And then he came here to Roosevelt. When I got out of school and I went and talked to him, he told me my best bet would be to go to start up my office in Duchesne. But I didn't agree, so I didn't do that.
Did your grandfather pull some teeth down at the general store?
Yeah, you can read about it in that family courageous
Yeah,
book.
that's where I read about it.
I've even got an old pair of forceps that was left over from him, but he wasn't a dentist.
So
He
Dale,
was just there and did things that needed to be done, I guess.
what year did you start in Roosevelt?
1962.
60.
As far as I
So about
know.
the same time as Dr. Buxton then.
Yeah, it was, Terry came just about that time.
Yeah.
Dale started in 62, we did in 63.
Okay.
As far as I know, as far as being a health care provider here in Roosevelt, I probably was doing it longer than anybody else, because I practiced dentistry here in Roosevelt for 47 years.
Oh my goodness.
10 years of it, a little over 10 years, was just part-time. But for 36 years and 9 months, I was full-time. And then another 10 years and some more. Anyway, I totaled about 47 years altogether, and I got tired.
Gary's going on 44. Yeah.
He wishes he were going on 20.
All right. Any other comments or questions? Dave.
Just a thankfulness for the doctors. The Buxtons did sacrifice family time, and all of those early ones. You don't appreciate that till you get older as much, but
Absolutely.
they certainly did. And you did, others. We appreciate it.
We sure do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was an opportunity to serve, wasn't it, Dr. Buxton? And Carol, everybody.
Especially in this community.
Yeah.
The people love you here.
Yeah.
We love the people.
Yeah.
And just another comment, after about 6 months, we took over mental health services, and there was a transition, and we didn't used to have that. Oh my gosh, be so grateful for your social workers and your mental health people here.
It would drive you crazy.
Well, it's very easy because they come to our house. There were some pretty serious situations. Be very grateful for the social workers who were here. I don't think we had that before in the UK when you came.
No.
That was not a
Social workers.
It's been a wonderful addition to the medical services.
I think the community recognized the sacrifice and the time that we were spending, and in payment for that, they were very watchful over our children. As teenagers, our kids could not do anything without us knowing about it. And they would say, "How do you know?" And we'd say, "Well, the community is watching you." And they tell us what you do. And they couldn't do anything without us knowing within a matter of hours what they were up to. So the community recognized that we cared and that our kids needed some watching, and they helped. They were very helpful. So David, the community was good to us too. So it was a good time. And whenever a new doctor would come to town, they'd ask me about Roosevelt, and the only thing I could really say was, it's a great place to raise a family. And it still is. So thank you very much.